Hi everyone, welcome to this Dialogues in Development for the DPU. Welcome to all the students who are not DPU students. I'm very impressed that you managed to find us, and I hope that what we have to say today complements your studies, because I think it's got wider relevance than just thinking about dilemmas in development planning. So my name's Kamna Patel. I'm an associate professor in the DPU in the Development Planning Unit, and today's session is sponsored by the Social Diversity Cluster of the DPU. It is my real pleasure to welcome today, in a hybrid format, our speakers for today's session. We have Sophia Fange, Romola Sanyal, Badru Bukenya here, and Shayanti Saha. And I'm going to give them a longer introduction in a moment, but first I wanted to introduce today's session. Or dialogue. It's called Dilemmas in Development Planning, Southern Subjectivities in Flux. And this idea of Southern Subjectivities in Flux and the prompt for today's topic is really a question that I've been thinking about for some time and been puzzled about for some time. And that is, what identities and practices are reified by the label Southern, in inverted commas? What practices and identities are reified? And I approach this question from two conversations, both of which concern the body politics of knowledge, race, and coloniality. And I think perhaps one of those conversations works harder to obscure or mask the racial politics inherent in the question. So the first conversation is rooted in the anti-racist political landscape of places like Britain, where bodies of colonized places inhabit the metropole, demanding to be seen and valued on an equal footing. In this conversation, we articulate the processes of our oppression in the language of whiteness, i.e. bureaucracy, which gives the mask of neutrality. The tenets of this conversation in universities, including this one, include things like the racialized awarding gap, the number of black women professors in the UK, out of interest 350 in relation to 18,000 professors altogether, or the disproportionate negative student evaluations from people long coded to expect authoritative knowledge to look and act in very specific ways. In this conversation, the body politics of race, knowledge, and coloniality become quite obvious, and I'd suggest they're treated as epistemological phenomenon, concerned with ways of knowing more and new things, and at its thinnest wedge is treated as a project of representation. The second conversation that is relevant to the concerns of places like the DPU is rooted in things that we might call the Southern turn in development studies and debates to decolonize development. This conversation could turn the body politics of race, knowledge, and coloniality into an ontological phenomenon, engendering profoundly different worldviews. Yet the motif, or the signpost for much of this, appears to be stubbornly stuck with turning to bodies elsewhere. The bodies of the South have long been a condition of development as a discipline, and perhaps as an extension of the age-old critique made of mainstream development planning, and as Romola and I have argued in a paper together, mobilizes territorializing knowledge. So in this conversation, the default appears to fix the South in a place, the global South, and Southern bodies as those in the South, imbued with new knowledge. And this all too often happens in ways disconnected or disassociated from that first conversation, which is ironically illuminated by activity around representation. So at these, what I'm calling ontological and epistemological crossroads, are two risks. There is the risk of our body politics being reduced to our bodies, divorced from the processes of oppression that may yet keep us as novelty for as long as the Southern and decolonial turn remains. And at these crossroads, we also risk stymieing difficult conversations between bodies made Southern here and there. And that leads us to, what does it mean to be Southern and think Southernly in contemporary development planning? And that's the question that I posed to our speakers today. So our first speaker, and I'm going to go with the order that was on the poster, is Dr. Badru Bukenya. Badru is an academic, policy analyst, and development practitioner based in Uganda. He's a senior lecturer in the Department for Social Work and Social Administration at Makerere University in Kampala, and a research fellow at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester in the UK. He holds a doctorate in Development Policy and Management from the University of Manchester, and an MA in International Development Management, which is where we met, and a bachelor's in Social Work and Social Administration from Makerere University. Badru's research focuses on political and developmental social work issues, including state civil society engagement, the politics of public service delivery, social protection, and the performance of public sector agencies. As a practitioner, Badru has engaged in initiatives that foster collaboration between the private sector, the public sector, and civil society in a bid to promote evidence-based programming. Badru was a regular guest lecturer in the Overseas Engagement Programme of the Development and Administration Master's Programme of the DPU when we partnered with Makerere University. Our second speaker is going to be Sophie. Sophie Afenge, in her words, is a black feminist of Ethiopian and Cameroonian heritage and is the Associate Vice President Policy at the Equality Fund, which is a global grant-making feminist organisation. Sophie is the former acting director of the Gender and Development Network, or GADN, which is a UK-based network of NGOs, academics and experts working to centre gender equality and women's rights within international development discourse and practice. Sophie is a former DPU student and a graduate of the MSc Development Administration and Planning. Our third speaker is going to be Dr. Romola Sanyal. Romola is an associate professor in urban geography at the LSE. Romola's research looks at the relationship between forced migration and urbanisation. She looks at how refugees and other forced migrants become city makers through building and inhabiting urban spaces, with reference to India and Lebanon in particular. Her work also looks at the geopolitics of humanitarian knowledge production, particularly on urban refugees. Titled Urban Humanitarianism, this work looks at how humanitarian organisations come to learn from and intervene in urban areas, and the politics that are involved in building and sharing that knowledge. Romola shares she grew up in Calcutta in India and in the San Francisco Bay Area of the United States. She's a former staff member of the DPU and the co-author of an excellent paper published earlier this year called Diasporic Scholarship, Racialization, Coloniality and Deterritorializing Knowledge, which was published in the Singapore Journal of Tropical Geography. And that's the paper that we both hopefully think is excellent because we both wrote it. And then our fourth speaker is Shayanti. Shayanti is a passionate advocate for public health, sanitation and social justice in the context of climate change. She has a rich background that spans India and the UK and is driven to improving health outcomes, particularly for marginalised and vulnerable communities. She currently serves as a sanitation and hygiene officer at UNICEF and works at the intersection of policy advocacy and ground-level implementation, advocating for WASH policies with states and national governments while collaborating with local partners to bring these policies to life on the ground. Shayanti is a former DPU graduate and graduated also from the MSc Development Administration and Planning. A very, very warm welcome to you all, dear friends, and thank you for being here as we mark 70 years of the DPU. The format. Each speaker is going to speak for about 10 minutes to the provocation, what does it mean to be southernly and think southernly? To be southern and think southernly in contemporary development planning. They have free license to answer that question however they wish, including critiquing the question itself. And I'm going to move to a general conversation amongst our speakers, and then I'll open it up for everyone else. What I would love to avoid is a Q&A, and to try to keep the dialogue in the dialogues in development. So I'd invite you to make your own points and to share your own reflections, experiences and insights when we come to that part of the day. So, Badru, you're going to be kicking us off, if that's okay. You've got 10 minutes. If you need it, I will intervene at 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. So you can start counting now. Thank you so much for the generous introductions. Greetings from Kampala, ladies and gentlemen, online and those in the room. Let me start off by giving a short story of how I ended up being here. So earlier this year, around February, March, when my friend Kamna contacted me to be a speaker at this event, I initially hesitated, and this was for a simple reason. I had never defined myself as a development planner. So I initially considered myself plainly as a university lecturer or at most a researcher, but not a planner. So my first task was to really answer the question, am I a development planner? So as usual, I quickly Googled for the definition of development planning, and I couldn't find one that perfectly, like fitted my profile. So most definitions that I saw were considered, they were considering physical planning and economic planning, which are quite different from development planning. But looking back at these initial steps, first of all, Googling, I must confess that my efforts were futile because I was looking in the wrong places. I was looking for a definition endorsed by well-known authors in the field. At least if I failed to get from the well-known authors, I was thinking that I would get one from international development agencies, at least the World Bank or UN agencies. So I unintentionally ignored looking at home sources. And I will share my opinions as to why this approach that I initially took is extremely problematic. So how could I fail to start the search from Uganda's own National Development Planning Authority, the NPA? It is the agency in Uganda that is in charge of national planning. It leads the process of generating plans, as well as conducting the monitoring and evaluation. Indeed, I was wrong. I was wrong because NPA clearly defines development planning in ways that resonated to my situation. So according to NPA, development planning is the process of identifying problems, needs, priorities, resources, as well as designing action plans with a view of improving the welfare of the people. And the development planning process includes plan formulation, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So as Kamna was giving a profile about me, she indicated my core job is teaching at the Makerere University and teaching development-related subjects. I also undertake a little bit of research. For government, I've participated in evaluations. I do conduct research on the civil society organizations, but also on behalf of civil society organizations. So my relationship with development planning really must be seen from these boundaries. But then after looking at that definition of the National Development Authority, I confidently returned to Kamna after like 2 days with positive news that I would gladly participate in the event. Okay, but there was again another problem. The invitation required someone to be a Southern development planner. So, and my question was, am I really Southern? And indeed, as per today's topic, what does it mean to be Southern? From the profile that Kamna has shared, I studied at the University of Manchester, and she was my classmate. So we first met in 2007, 2008. After that, 2009 to 2012, I did my PhD, again, development policy and management at the University of Manchester. So I was taught and mentored by non-Southern academics, okay? So the question is, am I still Southern if I've been really mentored by people not from the South? So I've kept in touch with many of my mentors through their impressive research projects in Africa. For example, for those interested in development issues, there's a project on effective states and inclusive development. That project was funded by the Department for International Development then, and it wound up around 2018. Then quickly, there was a successor project called the African Cities Research Consortium, okay, or SCRC in brief, and this one is also funded by the UK government, and it is running up to 2027. So in terms of research collaborations, you can see that I've maintained my contacts with the University of Manchester, and as Kamna indicated, I'm even a research fellow there. So again, the question I repeat is, am I Southern? So I will briefly share with you, in my teaching, I use the theories I was taught, or the frameworks that we developed from the Effective States and Inclusive Development project, or the African Cities Research Consortium, which is currently ongoing. I do not have homegrown theories to speak of. So does this mean I do not think Southern enough? So one can therefore argue that I must be suffering from what some have called extraversion. That is, being oriented to Southern sources of authority outside your own society. So extraversion, it is said, manifests in collaborations with especially universities in the North, that is Europe and North America, publishing in their journals, taking sabbaticals in those countries, and so on and so forth. However, when I reflected on my situation, I quickly realized that, first of all, there are some positives for maintaining, actually, there are many positives for maintaining this connection. But most importantly, we are mostly within, we find ourselves in this situation because of the circumstances that we work in. So to me, the alternative to extraversion is really academic extinction. Okay? So what I mean here is that myself and my colleagues that I teach with, or the colleagues that working in academic areas like me in Uganda, we really operate in a hostile context, what we may call a hostile context. And this is defined by limited public investment in academic research. For the last many years, government wasn't putting money in research, and therefore, if you had to do research as an academician, you really had to find it yourself. Of recent, it has tried to put in some money, but the funding is specifically focusing on sciences, and what the government defines as sciences is physical and natural sciences. Okay, but most critically, development planners write about what politicians do not like to hear. Okay, so we write about the politics of development, and if we were so critical to government, then they would really come for you. So what the connection that I have with my colleagues in the North, as I defined them, it helps me to put like a front that we know when we are doing research, it is mostly them who appear in the front, and my contribution will not really come out explicitly to government officials. And if they called me for a quick chat, I would easily undermine my contribution in the research that I do. So the other question that we have to look at is around what do Southern subjectivities really offer contemporary development planning. And to be honest, I'm not sure I understood it correctly, but from my own perspective, I would make a modest contribution. I would, going to summarize quickly what I think has been my modest contribution, but also what I think the contributions coming from the global South. So the first contribution is around challenging the political economy of knowledge, where the South is looked at as a source of raw materials. Raw materials, in this case, I mean the data, okay? The data that is then transmitted to the North for processing and refining into knowledge and conceptual frameworks, as well as the theories that then exported again back to southern countries. So the challenge that I put here is that I only collaborate where my contribution is not limited to data gathering, but extends really to knowledge generation, and that in academic circles really moves to co-authoring papers and books and stuff like that. A related issue is around the challenge to the colonization of knowledge production, okay? And this relates to the thinking that it is only knowledge from the North that is most authentic. The idea that I started with when I was looking for the definition of development planning, okay? And this is being challenged through ideas around co-production of knowledge, co-production of development intervention. And this comes about through arrangements that include partnerships with colleagues from the North, then colleagues from the South, and then colleagues from the community where we do research. So we, through these joint programs, we have developed politically attuned ways of planning and the implementation of planning and implementation of development programs using frameworks that are really, you may say, advancing the frontiers of knowledge, such as political settlement. Definitely, there's no time to go deep into these issues. But then the other thing has been around the increased emphasis on action research, whereby research that tests new approaches is also about testing those approaches to see whether they offer real life solutions to development challenges from the communities where this research is obtained. So the work on the African Cities Research Consortium that I referred to you earlier is basically around this. So we just 2 points, and then I pause. The other issue that I'm seeing is around the increasing focus on decolonization, not only in academic circles, but also in the world of development more generally. Recently, I was part of a project investigating shift to the power movement and the strategies among non-government organizations that are that operate as intermediaries between agencies and the civil society organizations in the global South. Then I also would like to mention one initiative that is from within Uganda. There's a national agency in Uganda that regulates research. It is called the Uganda National Council of Science and Technology. These days, the National Council of Science and Technology requires that any research that is coming from outside Uganda, okay, be it in any other African country or from the North, it involves, first of all, it has to have a partnership with local or national researchers, and then to ensure that that happens, it requires that there should be data sharing agreements between the people coming from outside and the national researchers before they can issue ethical approval. So people like me, we are using this, at least this legal aspect as a bargaining tool for an elevated position within the research projects that come into the country. So I will pause here and wait for comments and contributions from the audience. Thank you.
Next speaker is going to be Sophie. Let me pass that over to you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. So I just want to repeat the question again, which is, what does it mean to be Southern and think Southernly in contemporary development planning? So I think it's really important to set out, first and foremost, before getting into the substance of this discussion, that we really have to impress the notion that this idea of southern in the context of international development and not just development planning can't be understood in the absence of the notion of northern. The two happen or exist, are absolutely interrelated. And also, it's not possible to respond to this question, at least from my end, of what it means to be southern and think southernly without this alternative reference point, or what some might say the default, the northern. So these concepts of global north and global south are fluid, as we all know, but crucially we need to push ourselves to understand them beyond the really specific geographical boundaries in which it's conventionally understood, and I think Kamna helped set that out right from the beginning. And I think while today's discussion question on what it means to be southern and think southernly is pinned to contemporary development planning, I think very much like Badru, for me it has much wider implications in terms of international development thinking, discourse and practice. So it's definitely much bigger than that, and I definitely don't describe myself as a development planner, so I can't subscribe to this particular question. So with that said, where am I located in this discussion on what it means to be southern? So Kamna has already briefly given you a background on me, but to repeat, I describe myself as a black feminist of Cameroonian and Ethiopian heritage. I grew up in Malawi and now work here in the UK. I consider myself an immigrant in this country, and I've only been naturalized about a decade ago in the UK, so I've just become British. So all the physical geographies aside, do these credentials, me being a Ethiopian and Cameroonian heritage, having grown up in Malawi, me living here in the UK, do these credentials make me sufficiently southern? Question for you. Does my blackness in itself grant me automatic accreditation into this heterogeneous, nebulous mass that we understand as a southern? Does it? Or can we also say that my class, potentially, my class privilege, actually categorizes me as northern? Is it this really clear dichotomy between global north and global south? So I sit in this really gray area of what some people have fondly labeled south in the north. And clearly, as a person with my background and my own racial identity, living here in the UK, in the heart of empire, I have a very particular view of the world, which is shaped by my class, my race, my gender, my ethnicity, etc. And all of that informs and shapes my thinking as it relates to development planning, to theory, discourse, practice. It all is absolutely fundamental in thinking about it. So these very different ways of knowing that I have because of the identities that I possess, the ways in which I understand the world, often counter some of the mainstream orthodox Eurocentric understandings of the world in which we live, and as a process of colonization and through thousands of years of socialization, we have been taught to understand as being the default neutral, this orthodox way of thinking and understanding and knowing. And at the most basic and primitive of levels, I guess the way to be able to explain this, as a black person, as a person of color, working in the field of international development, if nothing else, if you can't take away anything else, it's that you can't ignore that you share a remarkable physical resemblance, if nothing else, with the people who are the supposed beneficiaries, and I use that term very, very loosely, of these development interventions. So the thems, we bear a remarkable resemblance, and the ways in which these thems are talked about, how they're pictured, how their plights are packaged into ways that are sympathetic to Western audiences, Western tears and sympathies, that absolutely has a bearing on how, as a person working in this field, I respond and I relate to these captures, the ways in which these thems are captured. So I think whilst not unique to international development, working in and existing in institutionally wide organizations, so the university being one, if you're working in an international development organization being another, where you're trying to wade through and counter these deeply entrenched Eurocentric ways of knowing is not an easy task. I'm sure there are lots of experiences that people can share in this room. And you're often having to appeal to your own humanity to challenge whiteness in a field of study and work that is deeply racialized. So all the time having to say, oh, but look at me, I'm not, you can't categorize me in this kind of way, but what about my humanity, in order to appeal to white sensitivities, which is very difficult. So while colonialism, race, and development are obviously inextricably linked, until very, very, very recently, there has been very little room, or actually no room in some instances, to highlight and talk about these interlinkages in international development agencies, and if you're an international development practitioner as well. And so we've had to go about our work without any reference to this history, which has obviously profoundly contributed to the development of this sector. So it's really been invisibilized and ignored. So I think it's just now, I would argue, over the last 4 or 5 years where there has been a proper reckoning, at least in the international development sector, where we're able to talk about these issues in a little bit more substance. So I go to this question then of what does it mean to think southernly? So fundamentally, at least for me, this means employing strategies, tools, and forms of analysis that resist the dominance of Western thinking and practice in the field of international development, and the aim being working to create more equitable futures. So, I mean, this feels very abstract. What does this mean in reality? How can you pin it down? So I would argue that to think southernly, you have to work to see the demise of the aid industrial complex. And I don't say that lightly, because I think, and I don't mean to say as well, if you are gaining a degree and master's at this fine university in international development, that ultimately your aim is to no longer have a job. But that is what we are seeking to do, which is that you cannot continue to perpetuate and sustain this international development system or structure as we understand it now. So a large part of that, in practice, means working to dismantle the very civilizing mission that is still present in contemporary development thinking, and practice and discourse, as the sector continues to prioritize a very victim-centered approach and narrative to how we understand development. I think one of the other ways in which this is another fundamental approach is this real need to disrupt this false divide that exists between us as these developers, the symbols of progress, and them who need to be developed, and only through our support and through our help. This divide absolutely needs to be demolished and dismantled, and recognizing that there are other ways in which we can categorize and understand ourselves in relation to one another. And also, I think you will inevitably, if you're working on, if you're getting a degree, a master's in international development or anything of that sort, you will be taught about log frames, Gantt charts, and all the rest of it. And all the ways in which we do development have a habit, unfortunately, of reducing these really long-term systemic struggles of people from the global south, and I use that term very lightly, into very comfortable project deliverables to be achieved within 3-year project cycles. So it really has this way of flattening the realities that people are living in, and the need to really challenge that is absolutely imperative if we're to think southernly. The other ways in which I think, just briefly before I wrap up, of thinking southernly is moving away from continuously problematizing the global south. So thinking southernly means that understanding that the global south, first and foremost, is not a monolith. Needless to say, but contemporary narratives have a habit of painting this entire entity as war-torn, drought-inflicted, ravaged messes where one-size-fits-all approaches are the ways in which you're going to resolve these massive, massive structural issues. So that clearly needs to be addressed. And also, it's that there is a need to recognize that instead of continuing to problematize the South, that a lot of and that being the site of change and transformation, that we never look to ourselves here in the North about what is it that we're doing here that is creating some of the fundamental messes that is happening across the South. So again, that is part of a Southern analysis or a Southern way of thinking as far as I'm concerned. And finally, I would say that the other area, way of thinking Southernly, is that you need to resist co-option. So in recent years, there has been this really big shift, especially within the international development sector, to embrace ideas like localization. So basically making sure that we're prioritizing the needs of local contexts, local people, making sure that our initiatives and efforts are being driven by their demands. But unsurprisingly, this hasn't gone far enough to embrace bigger ideas like decolonization, and which is really the need to not only recognize but also make visible and work to address the legacies that colonialism, empire, and racism continue to have on our daily lives, and the need to create more sustainable and equitable futures moving forward. And what we have seen certainly, 4 or 5 years ago with at the start of the BLM protests here in the UK, there was a big, massive push to address decolonization within a lot of organizations within the international development sector, and how that has now morphed and twisted into really more watered down offers or offers of localization, which are not the same thing. But instead, it's that we need to make sure that we are holding the line on trying to push for more progressive and equitable ways of thinking and moving forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Ramola's our next speaker. Go ahead.
I feel like Kamna has brought many birds of feather together. Because listening to these different interventions made me now think, well, what am I going to say that's going to be new and different? Don't know. And also that Kamna has also brought in a room full of people who don't identify themselves as being development planners and struggle to understand what that means. And I will put myself in that camp as well. So I, unlike Badru, just decided to neatly skirt that question altogether and pretend like she hadn't put those words in there, and simply focused on thinking about what it means to think Southernly, and to sort of take sort of Southern perspectives. And much of what I was going to say has already been said, so I'm going to sort of think on my feet as I go along, although I have plenty of notes. I guess I'll come into this discussion as an academic who is located in a Western institution, and pick up some of the concerns from there. And I will talk about urban planning, which is more the field in which I teach and in which I research as well. And I thought that, as Kamna said, that, we kind of came to this question, in a paper that we co-authored together, and the impetus for that also came from our separate experiences as women of color in Western academic settings, as immigrants, like you. I was born in a different country, so I was born and brought up in India. I moved to the US when I was a child. I took up citizenship there because my family did. Moved to the UK far later on in life, and like you, got citizenship here about a decade ago. Coming on to it, realize it's 2024 now, and a couple of years have disappeared because of COVID. And so I have this sort of, I've been an immigrant many times over, and I've also, one of the things that I have gained as a result of moving to different places is a deep appreciation of different places around the world, which is also why I chose to go to the Middle East. And the reason why Kamna and I also embarked on that particular paper was because we both did research in parts of the world that we did not come from. And people did not identify us as being part of, which we both found quite interesting in terms of how we were approached as academics, that we were naturally seen to speak on behalf of certain parts of the world. So we were seen to speak on behalf of India, for example, even though we would either we didn't research India at that time, or we had some research in India at that time, or we did research in other parts of the world, but it was quite interesting that those parts of the world were not associated with us. So that sort of gave us the impetus to kind of start thinking about, well, who has, different kinds of questions, including, who is able to do research in other parts of the world, who is authorized to go to different parts of the world to do research, who is not, who are naturally seen to write about certain parts of the world, and who are also seen as bodies out of place. So can you, in fact, go as a researcher from a particular ethnic background to go and research in a different part of the world, and how would that be seen both in sort of Western academic settings that we were part of, but also by others. So that was sort of how we had come to it. And I will come back, I'll circle back to some of that kind of towards the end of my comments. But one of the things that, when I was reading the prompt that Kamna sent me, made me think about how we teach. And for me, academic practice is a really important part of what I do. It's not just my daily job, but it's something that I reflect on quite seriously in thinking about what do we teach and how do we teach it. And I look at student profiles, and those who come in to do master's and PhD programs and so forth. And it always interests me, particularly as somebody who teaches in planning, that planning is taught as a discipline in a very particular way in many of the institutions that I have been part of. And we have a lot of students who come from different countries to learn planning in these institutions and then take these ideas back to their home countries. I'm not saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but it does perpetuate particularly this problem, as I think many of the earlier speakers have mentioned, is that the ideas, the knowledge is seen to rest in a particular part of the world. That we frame concepts and theories in certain parts of the world and then we export them elsewhere. And there's a fair bit of work that's been done on looking at precisely how those problems manifest themselves, even in something as urban planning. Right? And it's quite interesting also then, not just in terms of thinking about the fact that institutions like the ones that I have been part of rarely make an effort to understand how planning issues come up in different parts of the world, or how to rethink some of these ideas around planning, or to sort of undo many of the conceptual frameworks, or even do away with many of them, and instead see them as sort of fringe courses and fringe ideas that one can study. So you can take option courses on looking at Asian cities, or African urbanism, or planning in developing countries. But the core concepts around participation or around stakeholder analysis comes with very particular understandings of what that means. And that leads to a lot of very messy problems on the ground, because in many countries where these ideas are being exported back to, realities are quite different. And so it begs the question of why do we not privilege the institutions and the knowledges from these places? Why do we have to go elsewhere to get that stamp of approval? And maybe taking it a step further, why do Western institutions not make more of an effort to change their curriculum completely and have students go the other way? So why is it that we think it's completely normal for students to come to countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, Canada, other European countries, etc., to earn these degrees? And why do we not think that it's perfectly normal for people to go to other countries as well to be getting those degrees, not just as a one-off thing, but as a normal part of that global circulation of knowledge? So this is something that I find is a bit of a prickly problem for me, increasingly, especially as I sort of start to, as I sort of think through, what, the the sort of arrogance of Western planning, and the sort of very limited effort that goes into sort of really thinking globally about how we learn and how we share knowledge. But on the other hand, and I'll come back to some of the discussions that Kamna and I have had over the years, and some of the things that we talked about in this paper, there's also, and something that's been raised by the speakers, is that there is a real problem of talking about the South or the Southern as a distinct object in itself that is different. It's often exoticized and it's homogenized as being a single thing. And this is a problem that has long plagued development, the idea that development happens over there, in the South, it exists over there. So I teach an undergraduate course on Introduction to Global Development, and Poroj has been involved in that as well. And I remember the first time I taught the course, which was now 12 years ago, I make an effort when I teach the course that I will bring different parts of the world into conversation with each other. So if I'm talking about issues around sanitation, I will talk about Michigan in conversation with looking at sanitation issues in, say, for example, India. And I had some pushback from some students saying, well, why are we talking about global north countries, because development happens over there. And I then decided I was going to turn it into a mission where I give a half an hour spiel on exactly why development doesn't just happen over there, and we do need to think about some of these questions, where we are located. And I guess in some ways I'm echoing some of the arguments that David Moss makes as well, which is that there's a sharp divide between what is considered to be development work, which particularly in the United Kingdom, there's a habit of seeing development happening in a certain part of the world, and poverty-related issues that happen in the UK are seen as charity work. So there is that sharp division, which is deeply, deeply problematic. And it's increasingly problematic as we see what is happening around us. We have a cost of living crisis. We have a homelessness crisis. We have the fact that we have children who are, who have the real danger of going hungry if they don't go to school. And this is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We are talking about contaminated water. We're talking about gender-based violence that exists, that is pervasive in many countries, including the United States. And we don't talk about these as being development issues. We talk about these as being very specific social issues that can be addressed through policy and through charity work. And this creates this very superficial divide between what goes on over here and what goes on over there, and it doesn't recognize what we've talked about in our work as well as the first world existing in elsewhere, and elsewhere existing in the first world as well. So we have these deep inequalities in different parts of the world. So we have these islands of extreme wealth in many parts of the world. We have people who come from the middle classes and the elites to train themselves in these discussions around development and planning and go back as well. So we do need to acknowledge as well, who is being able to come to universities to be able to get that education and go back. But also in kind of coming back to that discussion around the thinking about the inequalities that exist over here and the crises that are embedded over here, is to think about that question of, these racialized, often migrant communities that inhabit the peripheries of cities over here. How do we see them? How do they speak? Where do we situate them? Where do we situate their ideas? Do we see them as being part of here? Do we see them as being part of there? And equally, when it comes to thinking about the kind of academic work that is done by diaspora or sort of academics from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, do we account for the differences amongst them? Or do we just think that, oh, well, we have, our minority faculty members and we have ticked that box? I'm sorry, that sounds very crude, but that is some of the ways in which some of this is done. When there are deep divisions between class, caste, and so forth that exists between different groups of people. And as someone who comes from, certainly from India, I will tell you this, that the vast majority or significant majority of academics, both in overseas but also in India, come from higher caste backgrounds, and it's something that is not accounted for. So we do need to think about some of these questions, and so I guess the Southern question becomes very complicated. And I'm loath to say that there's a single way of thinking about being Southern, but I think it's something that needs to be unpacked quite carefully and thought about more critically.
Thank you very much. Shayanti, you're our last speaker, and I hope you think you're a development planner. Is she still there? There she is. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Kamna and Badru, Sophie, and Romala. And I guess that's all, because after all that all of you have spoken, there's nothing much left for me to say. And probably, if not anything, I'll just summarize and it will help everyone else to sort of, bring forth the discussion. I mean, like Badru, I think I've gone through all the steps that he's mentioned, and after I'd been approached, I really sort of contemplated as to whether or if I should at all do it. And I've been contemplating this before even joining, and I'm like, what do I say and what do I do? Because a major part of this is also because I think I'm not an academic, and the language would be very different. The questions that were asked, I was going through one after the other, and I was like, okay, so I'll have to probably go through the definitions of all of this. And so, yeah. But anyway, I'll be drawing from my very limited personal professional experience. Thank you, Kamna, for that introduction. One major highlight that I'll pick up from that introduction is that I am from India. I have been in India for 26 years of my life. For like 26 years of my life, except 3 years in between, where I was in the UK, where I'd studied in DPU for a year and then worked there for 2 years as a researcher at UCL itself. So I guess everything that I'm going to talk about is will sort of come from these experiences that I've had. So I think while I understand the significance and relevance of this discussion in today's today's time, I would continue and pick up from where Romula left, that I'm also compelled to say that there is no uniform Southernness. Or Southernness doesn't mean anything as a homogenizing category, because it hides, the internal power dynamics in the global South, which then sort of interacts with capitalism and its attendant neoliberalism, as such that it creates a uniquely toxic mix. So we all know that colonial expansion or domination was sort of able to construct a hierarchy of like superior inferior knowledge, or thus of superior inferior people around the world. And it does not just end with the end of colonial administration. There are new forms and new characterizations of it that still persists. We always speak from a particular location in the power structure. Having said that, I am speaking from a particular location in this hierarchy, completely aware of the privilege and the entitlement that I have. And then I think another point that Sophie probably mentioned about that, and something that even I have experienced, is that that it is that there is an epistemic, it's very important to distinguish the epistemic location from the social location. The fact that one is socially located in the oppressed side of power relations does not automatically mean that she or he is epistemically thinking from a subaltern epistemic location. So there is also an epistemic north within the global south, and these groups within the global south often influence what knowledge is valued, how it's shared, who gets to define truth or reality in ways that mirror western colonial or elitist frameworks. For example, in many countries in global south, like elites or academics or people with economic power might have more access to education, technology, and global networks, and this privileged access sort of allows them to set the societal norms, to control the media or shape narratives, reinforcing their experiences and perspectives as the standard or the correct way of knowing and understanding the world. Uh, and simultaneously, there is also an epistemic south within the global north, and there is a complex interplay of gender, race, sexual and class hierarchies within the global, geopolitical or geocultural, geoeconomic processes of the modern world system, where there's ceaseless like accumulation of capital, which is affected by or either integrated to, constitutive of, and constituted by these hierarchies. So in my I also feel that there's also transfer of there's this continuous transfer of capital from the epistemic north of global south to global north, be it in the multinational IT sector or the stock exchange market or intellectual capital. And meanwhile, there's also a large scale migration of labor from the global south to the global north, driven by like factors that we all know, like economic disparity. So and the convergence of these two processes, they sort of reinforce capital accumulation in the global north, which results in, again, increased alienation of the global south. So I think, again, talking like working on the ground, I also feel that resilience and innovation are are some of the byproducts that are again celebrated, from the global south, be it in the context of constraint or the compulsion of survival. But uh, how much like agency is there, or how much of it is by choice, or how much of it is by compulsion, or how much of it is taken from for granted, how much of it is exploited, because when we talk about resilience, I think it's always a double-edged sword. So I'll give you a simple, like an example of a recent example. So that there's a so I'm currently based in Bihar, which is in the eastern part of the country, and there has been a recent flash floods, which is of a very different nature. It's been due to a breach of dams, and some of the northern districts of the state have been very, very badly affected. So, in one of my visits to one of these districts, which was sort of like in one of the households where some parts of these districts have been just swept away, and because of the nature of the flood, the damage, the loss incurred is very different. It's not due to just heavy rainfall, right? So in one of the households that we visited, there was this there was an old lady who was around 70 years old, and she was and she was lying on her bed, and she said, so it was on the 28th of September that water started seeping in at around 11 or 12 at night. And she said that she was inside that room with her cow from the 28th of September to the 2nd of October in the morning. And there was water seeping in. She was not rescued. And, she was there with the water level almost reaching the level of her bed, and sometimes also on top of her. And then she was like that, forget about water. We went there to ask if she's getting water or food or, and then she told us that if I've survived the floods, if myself and my cow survived the floods without food and without water, I can survive anything. So this is the kind of resilience, the indomitable resilience that we are talking about. There are many examples. Of course, this is at an individual level, but then there are many examples at a community level that are there. But then how much of it is again, how much of it is by choice, or how much of it is actually by compulsion, and how much of it gets exploited. So I think I would like to also, going towards the end of what I'm trying to say, is that in my professional experience, I have had, of working and participating with communities and working with the government. I've realized that there are a lot of times that a lot of programs work because there is complete agency given, complete ownership. And again, these are terms, these are definitions that probably needs to be sort of looked into because of the discussion that we are having. But then there are also programs where it has failed because we tend to overburden. For example, there are a lot of programs in Bihar where when we advocate with the government, a lot of it falls upon the onus of sustaining the program. The onus of making it a sustainable model falls on the frontline workers, the self-help groups who are working on ground, who are already very burdened, who are already coming from disadvantaged communities, who are already at the lowest socioeconomic strata, and who are expected to carry the onus of of sustaining programs. And then of course these programs fail, and it's bound to fail. So in my understanding, while there is a debate that a global problem cannot be solved or cannot be looked at a nation or a state level, while some parts of it might be true, it also needs to be a simultaneous process and cannot exist in isolation. Communities.
Can I ask you just to wrap up a little bit? Sorry, we've come to the end of the 10 minutes. Can you wrap up?
Yes. Yes. So I think that's where I end, saying that communities, enterprises, schools, hospitals, and all of the institutions that sort of regulate social life should be self-managed by people under the goal of extending social equality and democracy to all the spaces of social existence. So I guess I'll end here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to pass over. I'm not going to have a conversation amongst us. I think it's fair to bring everyone else in the 15 minutes or so that we have. There's one comment here. Before we get to the comment online, is there anyone who wants to say anything in the room? Yes. And remember, try to avoid the question format if you can, and say more, please.
Thank you for those really exciting ideas and reflections, and a lot of personal reflections and food for thought as well. So to me, I would begin with this idea that being Southern is really about defending another way of being, and also having the courage to make newer mistakes, because a lot of times we are sort of bound in this entire way of looking at the world and the way we operate, and we are so sort of tied that we want to not have that kind of space to be able to make newer, really have the courage to make newer mistakes as we tread along. So I think that's the first level at which I would define being Southern for myself. Second is also about the creative dissent. So that is something which I feel is really important part of being Southern. And from my research, personally, which I'm engaging here at DPU as a visiting researcher, I'm just discovering and realizing that this digital age is also a great equalizer in certain sense, because we all are visibly and invisibly colonized wherever we are living around the world. So the cross-colonization or cross-colonized world we are living in right now, there's no more, let's say, physical territories of colonization, but we all are colonized by 10 men ruling the world right now. So having said that, my question also specifically to Sophie is like, how do we really localize economies, and how do we dismantle the global financial structures which you sort of mentioned or briefly hinted upon? And at the same time, I mean, if we, let's say, if we sitting here in the global north, like majority of parts of the world, will not even have clothes to wear if we were not to exploit places like Bangladesh or Turkey, or let's say, I'm not situating geographies, but like we would not be even clothed. So if we don't exploit these parts of the world, so how do we develop artisanal skills in the geographical global north? Because it's also about cultivating skills in here. My last question is about how do we overcome the arrogance of knowledge produced in universities, which is also very detached from real life experiences, as I've come to realize more and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you pass to this lady here? Sophie, maybe take a note of it, and
Sure,
at the end I'll ask
exactly,
you for
sure.
a final sort of
Yeah.
thought.
Sure.
Yeah, no, Fee, you had your hand up.
Yeah, but I thought.
No, go ahead, speak.
So my question is about the university stuff that we had a discussion about. Is that we noticed that a lot of people come to Global North to study, but they were usually attracted by the social resources, the living benefits, and they kind of choose to reside within the Global North, and then maybe don't go back to their original country anymore. So that may cause a block of knowledge accumulation and also knowledge flow in between Global North and Global South. And also we talked about how university accepted students, but most of them were are from middle class and also elite classes, right? So my question here is more like, as scholars and also as part of university leaders, I would say, what should we do to kind of promote this equality between the classes, and how to kind of promote a progress in knowledge exchange? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, pass to Nora. And then I'll come online after you.
Thank you very much. Very insightful. For me, this question is a conundrum, because I'm what you call mixed race. I'm half Swiss, or full Swiss, full Iraqi. But I grew up in Austria, and I have the Austrian citizenship. But I've lived in the UK, in Argentina, in Nigeria. And so, depending where I go, my positionality changes. I'm either northern, and people tell me, oh, but you're not Arab enough. Like, you don't, just today somebody told me, you don't look Arab. And I was like, have you seen my blonde cousins in Iraq? Or really, you're Austrian, like, you should be blonde. And it really changes wherever I go. And so for me, you can't really have this distinction, because it undermines the contribution the so-called Global South has had to the construction of the Global North. Like, if you take, for example, medicine, how medical inventions were made possible through using bodies from the Global South to experiment. And so for me, it's really, it undermines the contribution, and thereby sort of covers the epistemic injustices that are in place, and the sort of dialectic, the hybridity that is internally constituted and not just like a binary.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. Maybe at the end you can say something to the student about this person about student. Yeah. I'm just going to read a comment that we had online from Ayob. Ayob, welcome. He writes, while I'm critical about the categorization of Southern, I believe thinking Southernly is thinking from the epistemic positionalities of societies that have experienced the burden of colonization and continue to suffer from colonization and coloniality. Centering the meaning-making and interpretation practices of socio-economic and political histories of formerly colonized societies is relevant if we want to undo the negative impact of colonization, Eurocentric knowledge production. Some people conflate social status, citizenship, and skin color with epistemic position, either northern or southern. This might be risky because geographic position or social status may not necessarily reflect one's epistemic location. Thank you very much for that. And I suppose that would be a counter to something that you said about us being all colonized by 10 men. It's something, yeah, it's something quite particular. I'm going to come to the back and then to the lady in the pink.
Thank you so much. So this is a quick reflection instead of a question. I was thinking that if the question is really about the individual level, like how myself as an individual experienced born in the Global South, raised in the Global South, studied there, because I was reading in one paper that, for example, in feminist theories, they said that we have multiple identities, so that's why we have also different variety of experiences, positionalities, and etc. So just because I am a woman doesn't mean that I am interested in the needs of women. In some moments of my life, a woman could be another identity, like the class or the race or ethnicity should be more important for that, could be more important for that woman instead of the gender. So I am thinking like we should be talking about this discussion at a structural level, as a shared experiences between these imbalances of power instead of individual level. Yeah.
I really enjoyed everything that I've heard so far today, and I just wanted to come and input my perspective a bit. I do anthropology, so and I'm currently doing my dissertation. It's looking at creativity and community building, and specifically at like things to do with people of African and Caribbean heritage and questions of Britishness in relation to blackness. And as I'm kind of going from this perspective of being someone who's knowledge learning to someone who's kind of now producing knowledge, I'm struggling really, and this has been really great for me to kind of think more about it, but also I feel like it's almost like a continual headache, because within anthropology there's that thing of positionality and always situating yourself in relation to the work that you're trying to produce. And then my experience as a black British woman, a third generation migrant, and all these kind of things that intersect. I'm really struggling with how to input this into my work, and kind of I want to ask when do we decide that we are kind of situating ourselves as researchers more in the work than we're situating the people and the things that we wish to research, and what are the lines within that? Like, how much do you feel that your own positionality and your experiences need to be evident within the work that you produce, and do you feel at times that this can actually like override and actually kind of bog down the details of the stuff that you're trying to create and the people that you wish to like positively impact in these things?
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have anything else that they'd like to share at this point? If not, I'm going to go to our speakers and see if there is a final comment you would like to make. Let me start with online. Shayanthi, were you able to hear all the comments that people made? There were no questions as such, just people sharing and a couple of questions along the way. But is there any final word that you would like to make at this point?
I'm sorry, I think some of the questions did not reach me really, but then I'll wait and probably comment after everyone else has commented.
Okay, fine. Badru, is there any final remark you'd like to make? I was thinking perhaps in relation to the question that one of our audience members had about what can be done with regards to international students in particular being a global equality of higher education, I suppose, in some way, so that we can challenge some of the classism about who gets to travel to the UK to do their masters and their PhDs. Badru, as someone who travelled to the UK for your masters and PhD, is that something that you can speak to in some way?
I think I have a straight answer to that, and there's no straightforward way of looking at this. Well, I remember the first time I came to the UK, we were a group of around 10 students who were given what were called the Equity and Merit Scholarships, okay? And so, yeah, we came to the UK, we're excited. A few of us, around 3, we were determined from the word go that we didn't want to stay. So all that we wanted was to really, get as much knowledge as possible, but also make connections, like as I talked about the eventual collaborations that we do have. But surprisingly, even some of the 7 who had initially stayed, all of them are now, back. Within like 3 years, we were all back to Uganda without even being, forced to come back to Uganda. So I would imagine that I think it takes an individual own conviction. Where can you do the contribution much more? So, yeah.
Thanks, Badru. Sophie, there was a specific question about how you're going to change the global economy.
It's Badru.
That's it. You got 1 minute.
Impossible question to answer, obviously, even if I had more than a minute. But I think it's clear to say that the way in which our economies are structured, designed, the international financial architecture that exists extremely skewed towards the benefit of what we class as the global north. So there are obviously analyses and work that is happening across the world, especially I would argue largely from the work that I've done as well, led by feminist economists who are thinking about ways in which you can think differently about how the economy functions, the things that we prioritize, the issues that we measure, etc. And then that goes into then thinking about how you design your tax systems, how trade functions, how we address questions around debt. But it's not a quick fix solution, obviously. There's lots and lots of work and campaigning and advocacy efforts that are happening around the world to try and address this very issue, to instill transformative responses. And there are some wins. There are, if we have time after this, I'll tell you about some of the wins. But it's very, very, very slow. But there's silver linings for sure.
Very quickly, I think there's a couple of sort of very, again, easy fixes to some of these issues. Not easy fixes, but there are some things that can be done and there are more structural issues that need to be addressed. One is, as someone who does admissions as well, or, who knows how admissions are done in certain institutions, we can look at, what institutions are prioritized in admissions here, and there are priorities. And so when we start to address those questions and we stop giving priority to students who, come from Ivy League institutions or what have you, as like, yes, you are getting, extra points and therefore you can come in for an additional degree, and instead partner with other institutions, let's say, that are, have historically been, serving certain communities of people, that helps in some ways to undo some of that, because you're partnering with different kinds of institutions. You can have, joint programs with them. You can give students priorities from those institutions, and those can also help in terms of diversifying where you're getting your students from, rather than necessarily skimming certain people from certain institutions and not others, because it doesn't give the same kinds of opportunities. So I think that, you know, those are some of the ways in which, but the brain drain issue is something that has existed for quite some time. I just very quickly want to say something. I know that some of what we're saying sounds very person specific, but actually a lot of this is structural. When we don't look at people who are minoritized in different parts of the world, and when we don't account for their voices, and we don't think about how they are part of these conversations, or how they think differently because they don't fit easily into envelopes, or they don't fit into certain spaces neatly, we are creating a problem. So while we might be using very specific case studies to highlight certain issues, actually these are structural problems as well. And they speak to bigger structures that also need to be addressed.
Thank you very much. Shanti, is that, you don't have to say anything at all. Is if something's been okay. I'll take that as a, you're okay? All right. Thank you all very much. I just want to leave you with one set of remarks from myself on listening to my friends here speak and having this time to hear them all together in the same place and in the same and with multiple voices. And I want to go back to something that I said in my opening remarks that might have been missed, or just to emphasize that bodies are made southern. This is not an innate condition, and it's not biological, and it's certainly not geographical. The bodies are made southern, and the processes of being made southern is the processes that I would encourage us all to be attentive to. These are the processes of capital, knowledge, and resource circulation, and have a hint of exploitation, if not more than a hint to them. And so the response for the bodies that are made southern is to resist, and I'll echo some of Sophie's language here, to hold the line. And to hold the line is not against the categorization and what the categorization does, but to hold a line against the processes of oppression that make bodies southern in the first place. And so with that, thank you all very, very much for joining us at our Dialogues in Development. We have a whole series going through to the rest of the year, so please take a look at the DPU events page to find out more. And my sincere thanks to Badru, Shanti, Ramola and Sophie for giving us their time so generously in this evening, and for all of you for turning up as well, and to our visitors online. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.